You trip on a curb, land wrong, and something in your ankle makes a sound you will remember for the rest of your life. 45 minutes later, you're in an X-ray room. 2 hours after that, you're walking out with a boot, a set of crutches, and a follow-up appointment already booked. Painful, annoying, expensive, but never once at any point did you actually wonder if you were going to survive it? Now, picture that same injury 40,000 years ago. No X-ray, no boot, no crutches, no follow-up appointment. Just you, a group of people who are equally clueless about the inside of a human leg, and a landscape that does not slow down or wait for you to heal. A broken bone in the ancient world wasn't an inconvenience. It was a genuine, immediate threat to your life. And yet, somehow, ancient humans were setting bones, splinting limbs, and getting people back on their feet tens of thousands of years before anyone had ever heard the word orthopedics. So how did they actually do it? Layambe. How did people with no anesthesia, no x-rays, and no formal medical training figure out how to fix something as complicated as a fractured bone, and figure it out well enough that the core technique barely changed for most of human history? And what happened to the people whose injuries were too severe to fix at all? Let's get into it. Here's the first thing you need to understand. In a hunter-gatherer band, mobility wasn't optional. It was survival. You needed to walk to find food. You needed to walk to find water. You needed to walk away from anything that wanted to eat you. A broken leg didn't just hurt, it turned you, almost overnight, from a contributing member of the group into someone who needed to be carried, fed, and protected while producing nothing in return. By every reasonable evolutionary logic, that should have been fatal, or close to it. A wounded animal in the wild is a target. A human who can't walk should, in theory, get left behind. And yet the archaeological record tells a very different story than that logic predicts. Skeletons from tens of thousands of years ago regularly show healed fractures, bones that broke, and then knitted back together in something close to the correct position. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but correctly enough that the person walked again, hunted again, and in many cases lived for decades afterward. Which means somebody, somewhere, figured out the fix. And once they figured it out, they didn't lose it, they taught it. Which is the first quietly incredible thing about this whole story. A broken leg. 30,000 years ago and a broken leg. 300 years ago were treated almost exactly the same way, using a set of ideas so fundamentally correct that modern medicine never had to replace them. Only refine them. The entire foundation of ancient bone setting comes down to one observation, and it's genuinely not complicated. If you hold a broken bone still, in roughly the right position, it heals itself. That's it. That's the whole trick. Bone is living tissue, cut off the movement, and the body does the rest. Blood clots at the break. A soft callus forms around it, and over weeks that callus slowly hardens into new bone, gradually remodeling itself back into something close to its original shape. Ancient humans didn't need to understand cellular biology to notice that stillness helped. They just needed to notice that the people who kept a limb immobilized recovered, and the people who kept moving on a broken leg often didn't recover at all. Or recovered badly, with a limb that healed crooked, weak, or not at all. This is worth sitting with for a second because it's easy to breeze past. Somebody, at some point in deep prehistory, watched two people with the same injury have two different outcomes and made the connection. That is the scientific method, running quietly in a human brain with no name for what it was doing, tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote the concept down. Before you can immobilize a broken bone, you have to deal with the ugly step in between, getting the bone back into position in the first place. Doctors today call this reduction. Ancient healers didn't have a clinical word for it. They just had to do it, usually with their bare hands, on a fully conscious patient, with nothing resembling pain relief beyond maybe a strong drink, a wad of something to bite down on, or several people holding the patient still. Archaeological and eerily written evidence from multiple ancient cultures, Egypt, Greece, China, and others entirely independently of one another, describes techniques that are recognizably the same core idea. Apply steady traction to pull the bone ends apart slightly, then guide them back into alignment. It's a procedure that requires strength, a working knowledge of what a correctly aligned limb actually looks and feels like, and, this is the part that's easy to underestimate, real nerve, because you are causing someone significant additional pain in the middle of an already agonizing injury, on the promise that it will make things better later. Get it wrong, and you've caused pure suffering for nothing. Get it right, and you've potentially saved someone's mobility for the rest of their life. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, written in Egypt but describing knowledge far older than the document itself, contains specific instructions for exactly this kind of manipulation: how to identify a displaced bone, how to apply traction, how to check that the alignment was correct before moving to the next step. This wasn't guesswork performed once and hoped for. This was a technique refined, taught, and repeated by people who specialized in exactly this kind of injury within their communities. Once the bone was back in position, it had to be kept there, and this is where ancient medicine gets genuinely impressive, because the solution ancient humans landed on is, structurally, identical to what you'd get in a modern cast. Archaeologists have found splints made from wood, reeds, and bark, bound tightly with strips of leather, linen, or plant fiber, sometimes padded underneath with wool or cloth to protect the skin. Egyptian mummies have been found with splints still in place. One well-documented example shows 2 wooden splints padded with linen, bound around a fractured limb, dating back roughly 5,000 years. The materials were whatever the local environment provided, but the underlying engineering principle, rigid material on the outside, soft padding against the skin, tight enough to prevent movement but not so tight it cut off circulation, is exactly the same principle behind the fiberglass cast a doctor would put on you tomorrow. Different environments produced different specific solutions, arrived at completely independently. Populations with access to certain clays used mud that hardened as it dried, functioning almost exactly like modern plaster. Others relied purely on layered wood and tight binding, sometimes reinforced with additional splints on multiple sides of the limb for extra stability. But everywhere humans figured out bone setting, they converged on the same basic answer, over and over, which tells you this wasn't a lucky one-off discovery. It was something close to an inevitable conclusion, once you understand that stillness heals. Some of the clearest evidence for how seriously ancient communities took injury care doesn't come from a text at all. It comes from the bones themselves. At Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraq, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal man who had lived with severe, disabling injuries for years before he eventually died. A withered arm, evidence of major trauma to his skull and body, and almost certainly limited use of one side of his body. By any purely physical standard, someone in his condition should not have been able to hunt, gather, or contribute physical labor to the group. And yet the bone evidence shows he survived for a long time after those injuries. Years, not days or weeks. That's only possible one way. Other people fed him, protected him, and kept him alive long after he stopped being able to do those things for himself. This wasn't a broken bone specifically, but it tells you something essential about the environment that made bone setting possible in the first place. These were not communities that abandoned the injured. They were communities willing to invest real, sustained effort into keeping someone alive through an injury, which is exactly the kind of environment where a broken leg gets a splint and a support system instead of a death sentence. It would be easy to assume that once humans figured out reduction and splinting, that was simply the answer, and every culture applied it identically. But look closely at different regions and you find genuine variation. Different environments and different accumulated knowledge produced meaningfully different approaches, even while sharing the same core principle. In ancient China, traditional bone setting developed into its own specialized medical discipline, known much later as dieda, with practitioners who trained specifically in trauma and fracture care as a distinct skill from general herbal medicine. Chinese medical texts describe not just the mechanical setting of the bone, but an entire accompanying system of herbal poultices believed to reduce swelling and speed healing, some of which, modern analysis has found, contain compounds with genuine anti-inflammatory properties. The bone setter wasn't just an engineer of splints. They were expected to manage the whole recovery process, herbs included. In parts of the ancient Americas, some indigenous cultures developed a technique of wrapping a fractured limb in wet rawhide, which would shrink and harden significantly as it dried, producing a rigid, form-fitting cast remarkably similar in function to modern plaster casting. Using a completely different material arrived at through completely independent trial and error, thousands of miles and possibly thousands of years apart from anything happening in Egypt or China. And across Polynesian island cultures, healers combined bone setting with an approach deeply tied to their broader medical and spiritual framework. Physical manipulation of the injury paired with specific massage techniques on the surrounding muscle, an early recognition that an injury doesn't just damage the bone itself, but the tissue and function around it too. Some of these massage-based recovery techniques bear a genuine resemblance to physical therapy principles used today, arrived at with zero knowledge of anatomy in the clinical sense, purely through generations of watching what helped a limb regain strength and movement after the bone itself had healed. None of these cultures were in contact with each other when they developed these methods, and yet every single one landed on the same non-negotiable core principle: stabilize the bone, protect the injury, support the recovery, while filling in the specific details with whatever materials and accumulated wisdom their environment gave them. That consistency, appearing independently across completely unconnected human populations, is some of the strongest evidence you could ask for that this wasn't luck. It was humans, everywhere, arriving at the same correct answer because the underlying biology never changes, no matter where on the planet you happen to be standing. Maybe the most remarkable part of this whole story is how little the core technique moved once it was established, at least in the traditions that got written down and preserved. Reduction and splinting, refined by Egyptian, Greek, and Roman physicians, remained essentially the standard approach to fractures for literally thousands of years afterward. The Greek physician Hippocrates, writing around 400 BCE, described fracture management in detail that modern doctors reading it today find genuinely recognizable. Techniques for traction, for checking alignment, for choosing when a splint needed adjusting as swelling changed over the following days. Roman military medicine, driven by the very practical need to keep soldiers fighting fit, became especially advanced at exactly this kind of trauma care, developing specialized tools and techniques for treating battlefield fractures that wouldn't look wildly out of place in a field hospital centuries later. Roman legions had dedicated medical staff whose jobs specifically included this kind of care, because an army that couldn't get injured soldiers back on their feet was an army that slowly bled out its own manpower with every skirmish. That's not a coincidence, and it's not because nobody tried to improve on it. It's because the underlying idea, hold the bone still in the right position and let the body do the rest, was correct from the very beginning. There wasn't a better answer waiting to be discovered. There was just a correct answer, arrived at early, through nothing but patient observation and the accumulated experience of watching what worked and what didn't. One broken limb at a time, across thousands of years and thousands of healers who never met each other but somehow landed on the same solution. Here's where the story gets darker and where the real limits of ancient medicine show up. A clean break, where the bone snaps but doesn't pierce the skin, had a genuinely good chance of healing properly with nothing more than reduction and a splint. But a compound fracture, where broken bone tears through skin and muscle on its way out, was a different situation entirely. Without any understanding of bacteria, without antiseptics, without antibiotics, an open wound around a fracture was an open door for infection. And infection, once it set in, could turn a survivable injury into a fatal one within days. Ancient healers didn't know why wounds sometimes turned red, swollen, and eventually deadly. They just knew from painful, repeated observation that it happened, and that certain treatments seemed to help. Honey, used extensively across ancient Egyptian medicine for wound care, genuinely does have antimicrobial properties. Modern science has confirmed this. Its low moisture content and natural hydrogen peroxide production create conditions bacteria struggle to survive in. Ancient healers didn't know the mechanism. They just knew wounds packed with honey seemed to heal cleaner than wounds left alone. So they kept doing it, generation after generation, until it became standard practice. This is the split you see across almost all of ancient medicine. Brilliant, functional solutions for problems they could directly observe and correct, like a bone out of position, and a much harder, much less reliable fight against the problems they couldn't see at all, like bacteria multiplying inside a wound. A person could receive the most technically correct splint in the ancient world and still die of infection a week later because the actual killer was invisible to everyone in the room. Sometimes an injury was so severe, bone shattered rather than cleanly broken, or infection had already spread too far to stop, that the only option left to save the person's life was to remove the limb entirely. This sounds like exactly the kind of surgery you'd assume was impossible without modern tools. And for a long time, archaeologists assumed early amputation, when it happened at all, ended in death from blood loss or infection almost immediately. Then, in 2022, researchers working in a cave in Borneo uncovered a skeleton dating back roughly 31,000 years, missing part of its lower leg, not from an accident, but from a deliberate, clean surgical amputation. The bone had regrown around the site of the cut, which means the patient didn't die from the procedure. They survived it, and lived on afterward, on one leg, in dense jungle terrain for years. This single discovery rewrote what researchers thought was possible in prehistoric medicine. It meant that somewhere in that community, someone understood enough about anatomy, blood vessels, and wound management to perform a procedure that should have been fatal by every reasonable expectation, and get away with it. That kind of surgery didn't happen in isolation. It happened inside a broader system of care that already understood how to manage wounds, control bleeding, and support someone through a long, difficult recovery. The exact same system of accumulated knowledge that made bone setting and splinting possible in the first place. Not every fracture healed perfectly, and ancient communities clearly understood that too. Skeletal evidence across many ancient sites shows healed fractures that knitted back together at an angle, or limbs that were noticeably shortened or weakened compared to the uninjured side. Clear signs that someone lived for years, sometimes decades, with a permanent disability from an old injury. And they survived it, which tells you something important about how these communities functioned. A person who could no longer run, hunt on, or travel long distances at full speed wasn't necessarily written off. They found other roles, tasks around a camp, teaching, tool-making, childcare. Work that didn't require full mobility but still mattered to the group's survival. This is easy to miss if you only think about ancient medicine in terms of the physical technique. The splint and the reduction were only half of the equation. The other half was a social structure willing to carry someone through a recovery that could take months, and willing to keep supporting them afterward even if they never fully recovered. Without that social commitment, all the technical skill in the world wouldn't have mattered. So the next time you sprain an ankle and someone hands you an ice pack, or you watch a doctor snap a cast into place in under 10 minutes, remember what that boot is actually standing on. Not a modern invention. A tens of thousands of years old idea, tested independently by people on nearly every inhabited continent, with none of your tools and all of your same bones, who figured out, through nothing but trial, error, and paying close attention, exactly what your body needed to fix itself. They set the bone with their bare hands. They splinted it with wood, wet rawhide, mud, or whatever the land gave them. They wrapped it in herbs in China, massaged it back to strength in Polynesia, hardened it like plaster in the Americas. And when that wasn't enough, some of them even learned to cut and to watch someone survive it. They just had to do all of it without anesthesia first, so you wouldn't have to. Let me know in the comments what you want explained next. See you in the next one.